You, remember our friend, Professor Parkins, don't you? Back then he was young, neat, and precise in his manner of speaking. He ventured off to the East Coast to take up golf for his winter holiday. A week or 10 days to improve his game, so he said. One of his colleagues at St. James College, an antiquarian who wanted to plan a dig in the summer, asked him to look at the site of the Templars' preceptory while he was there. The antiquarian told Parkins that the site must be quite close to the beach, about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn, where Parkins would be staying. Parkins couldn't get in anywhere else. Most of the lodging houses were shut up for the winter, it seems. And the only room of any size he could have was a double-bedded one. Professor Parkins insisted on having a fairly large room, for he was taking some books down and meant to do a bit of work. And though he didn't quite fancy having an empty bed, he supposed he could manage it during such a brief stay. Besides, whenever he wasn't writing, Parkins intended to spend his time on the links. I always felt that Parkins was something of an old woman. Rather, hen-like, perhaps, in his little ways. Totally destitute, alas, of the sense of humor, but at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions. Well, you've met him. You remember what he was like. Professor Parkins was made welcome at the Globe Inn, was safely installed in the large double-bedded room, and was able, before retiring to rest, to arrange his materials for work upon a commodious table which occupied the outer end of the room, and was surrounded on all 3 sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the shore to the north and south, respectively. On the south, one saw the village. On the north, no houses were visible, only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front was a strip, not considerable, of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans, and so forth. Then a broad path, then the beach. Whatever might have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. Parkins, being above all plucky, spent the greater part of his first day in what he had called improving his game, in company with another guest at the Globe, Colonel Wilson. During the afternoon, I assume due to his poor performance on the links, the Colonel's demeanor assumed a coloring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him. He determined, after a short and furtive look at the Colonel's bristling mustache, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the Colonel before the two would inevitably meet again at the dinner hour. And so he walked alone back to the Globe, along the beach. In picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught, partly in a gorse root, and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed his surroundings, he found himself in a patch of broken ground covered with small depressions and mounds. He must be on the site of the preceptory he had promised to look at. He remembered that the Templars, to whom this site had belonged, were in the habit of building round churches, and he thought a series of mounds near him to be arranged in a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try their hands at a little amateur research. Our professor, however, was simply eager to oblige his colleague. He paced the circular area he had noticed and wrote down its rough dimensions in a pocket notebook. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong shape which lay east of the center of the circle, apparently at the base of a platform or altar. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf was gone, removed by some boy or other creature. He decided to probe the soil here for evidences of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away at the earth. Now followed another discovery. His scraping revealed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another so that he might see better, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in the masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides were smooth and regular. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the fading daylight, he could see that it was a metal tube, about 4 inches long, and of some considerable age. It had become too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further research. This adventure had proved so interesting that he promised to devote more of the daylight on the morrow to archaeology. The object, which he now had safe in his pocket, was bound to be of some slight value at least. Bleak and solemn was his last view of the site before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the golf links, on which a few figures moving towards the clubhouse were still visible. The squat Martello Tower, the lights of the village, the pale ribbon of sand, the dim and murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but was at his back when he set out for the globe. The going was both good and quiet. Before bed that night, he turned the little object over by the light of his candles. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much after the manner of the modern dog whistle. In fact, it was a whistle. He put it to his lips, but it was quite full of caked-up sand or earth, which would not yield to knocking, but must be loosened with a knife. Tidy as ever in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper and took the latter to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look out at the sea and note a belated wanderer standing on the shore, just in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible, and the professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it was obscure to him. There were legends both on the front and on the back of the whistle, which he utilized to decipher the inscription. He supposed himself to be a bit rusty in his Latin, unable to recall even the word for a whistle. Still, he translated part of the inscription easily enough. "Who is this who is coming?" He laughed to himself. Evidently, the best way to find out is to whistle. He blew upon the whistle tentatively and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and, soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles round. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst of that, a lonely figure. Just then a gust of wind surged against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up, just in time to see the white glint of a seabird's wing somewhere outside. Parkins could not help trying to whistle once more, this time more boldly, and then another gust of wind, this time strong enough to force open the window and blow out all the candles in the room. The first thing was to get the window shut. Parkins was struggling with the small casement and felt almost as if he were pushing back a stout burglar. The gust slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Still the wind went on, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that Parkins thought he might be happier without it. Whether it was the wind or the excitement of golf or the researches in the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he was not sure. Awake he remained, in any case, long enough to fancy, as I am afraid I often do myself, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work every moment, and would entertain grave suspicions of his lungs, brain, liver, etc. Parkins shut his eyes and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again, overexcitement exerted itself in another form, that of making pictures in his mind. His experience on this occasion was a very distressing one. What he saw was this: a long stretch of shore, a scene very much like that of his afternoon's walk. The light was obscure, conveying an impression of a gathering storm, of a late winter evening, and slight cold rain. In the distance, a bobbing black object appeared. A moment more, and it was a man running, jumping, clambering over the dunes, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it was that he was terribly frightened. Though the features of his face were unclear, he was almost at the end of his strength. Now there began to be seen, far up the shore, a little flicker of something light-colored, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity, rapidly looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. Growing larger, it too declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise its arms, bow itself towards the sand, then run stooping across the beach to the water edge and back again, and then, rising upright, once more, continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. At last it came to a stop, stood upright, with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward. At this point, Parkins opened his eyes. With many misgivings, he finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night waking, rather than to be tormented by this persistent panorama, which he saw could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on that very day. The scraping of match on box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or what-not, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. The first match went out almost instantly, but the second one burnt better. and a candle and book were duly procured, over which Parkins pored till sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life, he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket and a sad mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast, he was in his room, putting the finishing touches on his golfing costume, when one of the maids came in. She asked whether he'd like extra blankets on his bed. Yes, it seems like to turn rather colder. Which bed should it be put on? Why, the one I slept in. Begging your pardon, but you seem to sleep in both. Leastways, we had to make them both up this morning. Dear me, said Parkins. I may have disordered the room more than I thought when I was unpacking my things. He then set forth determined to improve his game. On the links, Parkins found the colonel quite chatty as the morning advanced. Their discourse turned to the subject of the strong gusts of wind the night before. In my old home, we should have said someone, some dark and unsavory stranger, no doubt, had been whistling for the wind. Summoning it, if you like, said the colonel. Should you indeed? Parkins inquired about local superstitions concerning the wind in the colonel's part of the country. I don't know about superstition, said the colonel. They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. Parkins said that, for his part, he was a convinced disbeliever in the supernatural. No belief in second sight, ghosts, or anything of the kind? No, and nothing whatever of that kind. Now, as to whistling for the wind, Parkins said, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern wind are really not at all perfectly known. To fisher folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger, is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed a barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers, and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What could be more natural, then, than assuming some eccentric stranger had raised the wind? Now, take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call. Then Parkins related to the colonel the story of the whistle, and how he had come to discover it, and the two got on well enough for the duration of the day, not parting until light began to fail them. Only then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory. But it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. He might as well go home with the colonel. As they turned the corner of the inn, the colonel was almost knocked down by a boy, who rushed into him at top speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl, and still he clung to the colonel's legs. Once he'd quite pulled himself together, the boy said he had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe when he happened to look up at the front window and see it waving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it weren't a right thing, not to say a right person. Was there a light in the room? No. Which was the window? Was it the top one or the second one? The second one it was. The big window, what's got the two little ones at the side. Parkins' room. The boy ran along to his tea, and Parkins and the colonel returned to the globe. They were soon in the passage, and Parkins opened the door. A quick inspection found that nothing seemed to have been noticeably disturbed. This is more serious than I thought, said Parkins. Now, he went on, if the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that I don't approve of it at all. He busied himself in opening the door. which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said. "Nothing seems disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one. But it does look as if someone had been playing tricks with it." It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most torturous confusion. Parkins pondered. They rang for the maid, who, to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room and hadn't been back since. No, she hadn't had any other key. No one did, aside from the hotel manager. This was a puzzle. Had the staff of the hotel been playing tricks on him? No. Parkins, fair-minded as he was, could detect nothing which pointed to the guilt of anyone employed by the Globe. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the colonel. The matter was dropped, and the two men parted for the night.
Oh, come thou day spring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy...
By some unfortunate accident, there were neither blinds nor curtains to the windows of the professor's room. The previous night he had thought little of this, but tonight there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, Parkins was a good deal annoyed, but he succeeded in rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins, and a stick and umbrella, a screen which, if it only held together, would keep the moonlight off his bed, and shortly afterwards he was comfortably in that bed. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realized what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen? Could he even manage to sleep if he did not? There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, and there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again, and there was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could manage. I can figure to myself something of the professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have, in a dream, 30 years back, seen the same thing happen. But you will hardly perhaps imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. Parkins was out of his own bed in one bound, and dashed towards the window, where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden, smooth motion, slipped from the bed and took up a position with outspread arms between the two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in a horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he did not know why, to touch it. And as for its touching him, he would sooner go crashing through the window than have that happen. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion, turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and darted towards it, and bent and felt over the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder, as he had never in his life thought it possible. Then, moving forward into a shaft of light, and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible, intensely horrible, face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. It leapt towards him upon the instant. As it groped and waved, one corner of its draperies swept across Parkins' face. He could not keep back a cry of disgust, and the next moment he was halfway through the window, backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close to his own. At this, deliverance came, as you will have guessed. The Colonel burst the door open, and was just in time to see the dreadful tableau at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the floor lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself keeping everyone else out of the room, and in getting Parkins back to bed. The Colonel wrapped himself in a rug and occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, the Colonel left the hotel door, carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as his very brawny arm could send it. There's really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot bear the sight of a robe or a coat hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field, late on a winter afternoon, has cost him more than one sleepless night.
Hey guys, want to smoke some pot? Maybe go skinny dipping in the lake?
Bitch, it's January. Who'd want to go skinny dipping on a night like this?
I guess you're right. It is a little bit chilly for camping. Why'd you bring us out here, Byron?
Because I'm going to give it to you straight about Friday the 13th. You see, that cabin over there on the edge of the lake? That's the old Fukada place. 3 years ago, on Friday the 13th, a newlywed couple moved into that cabin to get away from the city. They were never seen again.
What happened to them?
Nobody knows. Story goes that when they moved in, they found an old radio playing some strange, horrifying broadcast, a rogue transmission that drove them to madness. All signs point to them running off into the lake and drowning. Thing is, nobody ever found the bodies.
What a load of horse shit.
Is that true?
Some people say they're still there, haunting that cabin. They say that if you come around the old Fukada place on Friday the 13th, you can hear that old radio playing the same broadcast that drove the newlyweds insane.
Come on, Byron, you don't really expect us to believe...
What are the rogue transmissions? Are they murderous? Are they monstrous? Whatever they are coming to this podcast. Yes, the one you're listening to right now. On Friday, January 13th, 2023, Whatever you do, don't dare listen alone.
Hey folks, we're the Drunks versus the world.
The naysayers say that our feeling vibe is not conducive to a business partnership.
And so I ask, what the is?
Have I seen you before?
Maybe in a previous life.
Did you steal my Jello?
No.
We left it at the old folks' home.
At the old folks home during that
During
thing?
We played pool, we lost, I think, and then she stole some person's coat from the bar.
Oh, wow.
And then I decided to go with her to Walmart of all places, and she starts taking clothes and stealing them and putting them in her purse and ripping off the tags.
Is that where your life went wrong? You started hanging with a bad element?
Probably before that.
No. I suppose she'd still bitch at her boyfriend. The robot gets all the fun parts of the relationship.
Go to our website, drunksversustheworld.com. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can listen to us on Spotify, Anchor, Amazon, iTunes, and Good Pods, and wherever else you listen to podcasts.
Dude, that was kind of sick. We should actually start
That
the
was pretty awesome.
Wing that,
Right?
We got to do it.
Absolutely.
We got to do it. Let's start this
I'm Edward October. For more true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.